Hello, my name is Jeffrey Hoare, and I'm here at the invitation of Deborah McConaughey to reflect with you on three things that matter as you go through the Nehemiah congregational development process. I am remarkably unqualified, except that I answered Deborah's invitation, but I have served parishes in Alexandria, Virginia, and recently 18 years at All Saints Church in Atlanta. And I'm currently the interim rector of the Church of the Epiphany in Washington, D.C., where I have recently moved following my lady wife. It is a joy to be here and look forward to our conversation. Here's a prayer I've been using a lot in the last few days. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Almighty God, who has given us this good land for our heritage, we humbly beseech thee that we may always prove ourselves a people mindful of thy favor and glad to do thy will. Bless our land with honorable industry, sound learning, and pure manners. Save us from violence, discord, and confusion, from pride and arrogance, from every evil way. Defend our liberties and fashion into one united people the multitudes brought hither out of many kindreds and tongues. Endue with the spirit of wisdom those to whom in thy name we entrust the authority of government, that there may be justice and peace at home, and that through obedience to thy law we may show forth thy praise among the nations of the earth. In the time of prosperity fill our hearts with thankfulness, and in the day of trouble suffer not our trust in thee to fail. All which we ask through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So as Deborah and I conceived what would be helpful for those of you in the Nehemiah process, we started talking about three core practices of Christian community, both Christian communities themselves and Christians in community. And those are worship and service and the practice of generosity as the three that I've been working with now for a number of years. A practice is part and parcel of something bigger than itself. So you practice the piano if you drill the piano scales if you want to play music. You do drill if you want to be good at soccer. And if you want to be a disciple, you need to drill for abundant life. So we're talking about Christian formation in community through three core spiritual practices. But first, it's worth remembering that community itself is, let's see which way this works. Well, it worked a moment ago. Not to worry. The next slide says community. Very, very profoundly interesting stuff. I want to think back to the beginning. You remember the Apiru were an underclass of almost subhuman, people considered almost subhuman in bondage in Egypt. The slaves that Moses brought out of bondage were called the Apiru, and from which became Hebrew. And they were brought into the wilderness, you know the story, and in the wilderness they were formed into a people. They were formed into a people by the gracious gift of the law of Moses, the Torah, the Ten Commandments, not essentially and first and foremost a bunch of rules, but first and foremost a gracious gift of identity. We are the kind of people who love God. We are the kind of people who love our neighbors. We're distinct from some of the peoples around us. Mummy, the Baalites have temple prostitutes and I want one too. Well, that's not what we do in our family, dear. All right, that's how the law was working. It was a distinct people, people of God amongst all the peoples that they ran into along the way. And that community was marked by love of God and love of neighbor, by care for the poor and the orphan and the widow and the stranger. And that drumbeat comes through the scriptures over and over and over again. And it is the foundation for our own community. We are the community of the people of God who have these core values about what really matters, and we'll be talking about that as we go. So I talk about three core practices: worship, service, and generosity. But you might have other ones. Because these days, about everything, you read a magazine, about everything on the planet gets called a spiritual practice. Mindfulness is a spiritual practice. Yoga is a spiritual practice. Well, that's great. And you might have a different list. I mean, Bible reading, for example, might be considered fundamental for many of us. I sort of include that in what we're talking about when we talk about worship. And it's worship that I'm mostly going to be addressing today, and we will spend a little time thinking about service and generosity, but I understand there are other workshops that you're trying to avoid on stewardship, so I do have a big long section on that, just so you know you're going to get some of that as we go. That's good. That's good. That's one. Okay, I'll give you a perfect. There aren't that many slides, but as Deborah and I talked, if the foundation of who we are is expressed as Torah, then in many ways the Sermon on the Mount becomes the new dispensation, the constitution of the new humanity. And so, as we thought about these practices, we thought about the Sermon on the Mount, and they're all in there. When you pray, do not pray as the hypocrites. I want you to take 5 or 10 minutes so that when we talk about worship, you've already brought something to the table. And you can probably do 2s and 3s or round the tables. And I'd like you to ask yourselves, and you can go to the next slide, what do you think worship is? What are we doing? A lot of the time when we talking about congregational development, worship becomes a matter of anxiety, or it becomes a matter of culture wars about musical styles or whatever. But what do you think we're doing when we worship? Or what do you expect to happen if you worship? When you worship, why do you bother? What's going on? I'd like you to spend 5 or 10 minutes talking about that among yourselves, if you would. There's the lovely story of the acolyte that comes home from the 7:30 weekday Eucharist, and his mother says, well, were there lots of people there, darling? And he says, oh, yes, Mum, there were the angels, the archangels, the whole company of heaven, and Father Smith and me. So, thank you. So, anything else? All right. In the last few years, I've been privileged to teach seminarians at the Candler School of Theology who are looking at exploring congregational parish ministry. And one time we met in the churches where they were serving. And one time we were in a session, we were in a Methodist church, and we were about to talk about worship. And the bulletin from the previous day's service was there, and the seminarian was here, and I said, and the bulletin, the sort of tagline on the cover of the bulletin was, drawing you closer to God. And I said, wow, can you do that? That's incredible. Could you tell me how to do that? How do you draw people closer to God? Because that's what you're advertising. Really? Is that what we're doing? Because that sounds to me like it's pretty tricky. And as we talked, it became, I wasn't trying to make fun of her, but it became clear that sort of notion that somehow worship involves or is in particular some kind of experience or some kind of closeness or some kind of guaranteed communication with God gets to be pretty tricky, doesn't it? If we think we can make that happen. Because it seems to me the moment we start trying to create an experience, we're manipulating. It seems to me we're then playing with people's feelings in some way, shape, or form. And so what do we think is going on? You know, when worship in our churches, when there's a national decline, you may have noticed, people who think they're very, very engaged in the church suddenly find that instead of once a month or once a week suddenly becomes once a month, and suddenly that's once every 6 weeks showing up for worship. And what do we think is that a problem? So suddenly people start getting anxious and saying we got to attract them back, right? We've got to somehow be attractive to make them want to come. So let's get a new musical style, and let's put a banner outside the church that says, with one of those A's with a circle around it, so it shows we're hip and we can get millennials. the anxiety-driven response to trying to create some sort of experience that's attractive. I mean, really, you can get that better at a Tina Turner concert. Or at a football game, for that matter, where you're part of a big crowd and it's really exciting. What do we think we're doing in worship, really? Many of the writers about it, we can clip to the next one. Many of the writers about it talk about worship as somehow connected with experience. Evelyn Underhill, in Worship, the response of the creature to the eternal is her sort of core definition. There's a chap called Brian Spinks at Yale, which is the next one, who wrote a book called The Worship Mall that's now on cut-price racks in sort of Cokesbury bookstores because it didn't sell real well, and you can pick it up for a song. And he explores an awful lot of worship styles. And at one point he's talking about a church, a Ginghamsburg church in Trip City, Ohio, and their worship, he describes in great detail, is shaped by a book by a chap called Michael Slaughter called Out on the Edge. And what Michael Slaughter says in this book is postmoderns are not looking for information about God. This generation is looking for an experience of God. Well, that's okay, but they then set about trying to give it. And they set about it by doing music and by building to climaxes, and they describe the worship in great detail. And I find myself reading that and saying, what's the difference between that and manipulation? How do you know God's got anything to do with it? Oh, we pray about it. Good. That's encouraging. But even Brian Spinks, and we go to the next one, winds up seeming to get at that worship is somehow bound up with experience. Liturgy needs to be powerful enough, he says, to allow worshippers to grow in love, even fall in love with the bridegroom, and to make love. Liturgy should entice and enchant us not only to desire, but also to fall in love with God and thereby with our neighbors. It keeps pointing towards some kind of experience. Some of you may have read a woman who writes a lot about worship called Marva Dawn, called it a royal waste of time. And it's a waste of time because it's really about enjoying God's presence. A number of years ago, I was whining about my prayer life to a spiritual director. He died a few years ago. Some of you may know Paul Wessinger was one of the Society of St. John the Evangelist, and they opened a house in Durham, North Carolina. I started my ordained ministry in Raleigh, and so I would go over there and talk to Paul. I remember my first boss, who's now died, when the Cowleys moved to Durham, North Carolina, he was running around trying to raise money for the Home for Unwed Fathers. Anyway, Paul was a great man, and I was whining about how boring my prayers were. And he said, Jeffrey, you're looking for the effects of your prayer in the prayer itself. You need to look for the effects of your prayer in your life and not in the prayer itself. And he was absolutely right. I was praying in order to have some kind of experience of God. I wanted that powerful sense of closeness. I knew the difference between, what happens with psychotropic drugs and God. I knew that difference. And I was wanting an experience. And he said something profoundly important. He said, look for the effects of your prayer in your life and not in the prayer itself. If you ever have a profound experience of God, it is always a gift of grace. It can never be manipulated. It can never be conjured. Music is important, certainly. But to what end are we playing music? Just to give people an experience? I have a very high-powered organist at the church where I'm an interim. It's a wonderful parish, Church of the Epiphany, and it starts with basically the 8 o'clock. It's a couple of hundred homeless people who've been in Bible study and Narcotics Anonymous and gospel art, and they come to church before breakfast, and many participate. We have some norms like it's okay to sleep, but you must do it sitting up when we're actually having worship. You know? Just like every other Episcopal church in that sense. And then they're served a breakfast. Then we try and clean everything out. Before the 11 o'clock crowd comes in, there's still some homeless people with their stuff around. And then a choir of great quality and a musician who's an Oxford-trained musician. And he's always talking about the elegant liturgy, and he designs wonderful liturgies. And I keep saying, look, can we please have singable hymns? I realize that's an elegant wedding of text and music, but if it's not about participation, then we're losing something. He says, we know that. I said, no, the choir knows that. The congregation isn't singing. So we go back and forth on that, and I'll circle back to some thoughts about music along the way. But this is true of all spiritual practice. Look for the effects of the practice in your life rather than in the practice itself. Because if we get into manipulation, we get ourselves off the rails. Some of you may be familiar with the work of James Allison. James Allison is a Dominican at this point in his life. He's a disciple of René Girard, the French cultural critic. Any bells? Well, Bob reads everything. Well, Allison has a number of collections of books of essays which are quite accessible, and there's one called Undergoing God. We can go to the next one. And in this, he has an essay called Worship in a Violent World. And he talks about false worship. He says, I could talk about raves, I could talk about football games, I could talk about this, I could talk about that. But he starts talking about Nuremberg. And he talks about Nuremberg as worship. And if you've ever seen the movies of the rallies at Nuremberg before the Second World War, you know that everyone's built up into a crescendo of excitement, and then the Führer will arrive almost as an apotheosis, sort of sometimes literally from a helicopter or from an airplane, and will be there in the midst of the people, in the midst of the Volk, who are going crazy with a great sense of powerful fellow feeling, and they'll be told about the other, they'll be told about the problems, and they'll be all worked up. We've seen a lot of this in the last few months in this country, and it's a very common thing of getting a crowd to want to be active. And James Allison says after all that's been going on, they go home. And on their way home that evening, though they may not notice it, part of the magic of the day will have rubbed off on them. They will look at a Jew from across the road in a different light. He will have lost personality in their eyes and become a representative of the kind of thing the Führer had suggested to them. They will be that much closer to turning a blind eye to his disappearance, to agreeing that old Mr. Silverstein the cobbler is indeed a threat to society. To the divinization of the one, there corresponds the demonization of the other, which is the dehumanization of them all. There's all kinds of public liturgy that is designed quite consciously to move us to a particular position. Is that what we ought to be doing in our churches? Nuremberg worship is essentially dangerous. There's always someone governing the proceedings to a particular purpose. And I think you can see this in churches that are completely focused on abortion or anti-abortion, on immigration, on race, on Islam, secularism, liberalism, who are finding themselves able to get a sense of unity over against some other. Years and years ago, I taught at Virginia Theological Seminary on the side, and I had a priest from South Africa right after the end of apartheid. And he was really struggling. He said, Jeffrey, we don't know, now that apartheid's ended, we don't really quite know how to be the church. because we've been so focused on ending this wrong that what are we going to do now? You know, it can be in the service of good, but there's something not quite right going on when that's what's bringing about our sense of unity. I wonder about our brothers and sisters in the Roman communion and how they're doing if they don't have that complete agreement about we're fighting abortion, for example. James Allison, we can go one more, says, the only people for whom it matters that we worship is us. And I think that's right. I don't think we're placating some great juju in the sky or trying to get a good crop. I don't think God's sitting there saying, worship me. I need you to worship me. You know, God, that feels good to me. You know? I mean, that just doesn't seem to me to be what God's about. As I read the story, the only people for whom it matters that we worship is ourselves. It is entirely for our benefit that we are commanded to worship God. Because if we don't, we will have no protection at all against the other sort of worship, the Nuremberg worship. We will allow our hearts to be formed by the desires of the contradictory social other that is around us, and that heart will eventually participate in its own heartbreak and self-destruction. I think that's what's happening to my friend in South Africa. Signs of false worship include pursuit of a particular agenda, even when it's a good agenda. When someone is creating an over-againstness, we're the righteous, they're not. We're good people, they're not. And it happens over and over and over again. So if that's not worship, we still got the question, what is it? We kind of know what we do. We go through the service, the ministry of the word, Eucharist, so on. I want to be clear, I don't think there is no place for affect in our worship. I don't think it's an intellectual matter entirely. But I think what we're doing is turning, or being turned. Greek scholars will recognize metanoia, usually translated repentance. We're turning or being turned toward that which is of ultimate worth and allowing that which is of ultimate worth to shape our lives. And we do that, we could talk about this in lots and lots of different traditions, including, if you've been to African American worship of the non-Episcopal variety, where there's a lot of pastoral movement and it's almost like it's not real if someone doesn't fall out. Even that is sort of a cultural structure of turning toward that which is of ultimate worth by telling and enacting the story in some way, shape, or form. And sometimes we tell the story in somber tones as we head towards Easter, and sometimes we tell the story using trumpets. Is that manipulative? Or is that an accentuation of the way we are telling and appropriating the story? Is it important that people have a wonderful experience in church? Or is it more important that God is honored and we are shaped by what really matters, so that when we go to the polls, we remember who we are? Or when we go to work and there's something going on that needs someone to say something about it, we remember who we are. And can we do that? It seems to me we do that more readily and more easily and more gracefully if we have in fact been involved in worship. So, worship is turning or being turned toward that which is of ultimate worth. And we do that in our tradition by telling and enacting the story around the table. That's kind of my simple version of that. So as we think about congregational development, make a slight shift here, all this anxiety about their not coming to worship, and we have, parochial reports, think our identity is somehow bound up with average Sunday attendance. It's just a metric. It's just a metric. But what seems to me to be important about the metric is if our people are not worshiping regularly, are not practicing the core practice of the faith together regularly, then it seems to me that's going to be a big problem for us as a spiritual community. And so is the answer to get terribly anxious about that and then rush around trying to be more attractive? Or is the answer to think about how do we get our people to worship where they are? And it might not look like candles and vestments. So this will not necessarily, I don't offer this because it's the thing to do now and rush out and do it, because it won't apply in most of our communities. But in the community I served in Atlanta, we had between 5 and 7 on a Wednesday night, give or take 150 to 200 people for supper. And many of them were there because we had children's choirs, children everywhere. And of those people, they were there faithfully every Wednesday. They were engaged in the community. They were friends with each other. Their children were singing the songs of God. They were having supper. And they often didn't find Sunday remotely useful compared to that, and would often only show up when their children were singing in church. I'm generalizing. And we started saying, well, what can we do about that? And it's not going to be, let's cram another thing into Wednesday night. It's already a full schedule for everybody, with the promise they're going to get home at a reasonable hour with the children having done their homework and had choir practice and been fed, and someone else take care of the dishes. And we're not going to stop and let's go in the church and do Compline, because that worked in Seattle. Or let's all go to St. Stephen's Richmond and learn about Celtic worship, because there's the answer. No, what we said was, how can we do this within what's going on? And so we started a practice of worship in the middle of Wednesday night supper. We never quite found the right time because people come and go. But a bell goes and the children leave the one-eyed babysitter that's over in the corner of the television screen and go join with their families around tables where they're eating. And there's already bread and wine on the table, a very brief prayer, piece of scripture, a BLT, blessed little thought. It's a homily, essentially. They serve each other. Bell goes and they go back to their places and we move on. And 7 minutes max. And after the first few weeks, everybody just expected it. The clergy were really nervous. They want to know, is it Eucharist? And I said, well, is it worship? Is it turning toward what really matters by telling and enacting the story around the table such that it shapes our lives? And in the end, it is technically, if you're not too worried about the rubrics, it is technically a prayer book Eucharist. I did that to help them feel better about it, because they're going to have to lead it. But I don't really care if it's Eucharist at one level. It's nice that we could do it that way. I care that it's worship, because now there's 150 people worshiping every single week. And we were starting to hear back things that got said there. Can we record it? Because my friend didn't hear it. Well, that's a bit more than we had in mind, but how do you, in your communities, help people practice the most fundamental shaping of who we are where they are? And it might, I don't know, it might be Starbucks. It might be before the soccer game. And it might not involve vestments. It doesn't mean we stop doing church. We still got to have Christmas, People still want to gather for that kind of telling and enacting the story. But if they're not doing it regularly, it seems to me that the problem is it seems to me the problem is we're letting a core piece of who we are, possibly the most important thing that shapes who we are as the people of God, we're letting it go. So I'd say, let's not be anxious. And we're going to talk about anxiety some more. Let's not be anxious. Let's figure out what we think worship is and then help people do it. And that's very different, it seems to me, than worrying about whether they're having an experience of God. I think that's God's business. I don't think we can do that. I think what we can do is tell and enact the story in the most beautiful, careful, thoughtful, joyful, considered, elegant, whatever your values are, way that we can do, and God will work the rest. We're not God. I know that's news to many of us, but if worship is simply that, turning to that which is of ultimate worth and allowing the practice to show forth in our lives, then it seems to me we don't need to be anxious. We just need to figure out how to help people do that. It's almost 3 o'clock. Do you need a break or can we keep going? What do you...
Keep going.
Keep going? All right. Then let's do a new slide. Yeah. See what we got. All right. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on service because there's a level on which everything can be service. But I do want to talk about what it means to think of service as a practice that helps us form the heart of a servant. That what we look for out of our practice of service is an attitude that is fundamentally about the other, giving ourselves away in love. In service we are freed. In giving we receive. In dying we live. So I'd like you to think about your own communities or communities you've been involved with and have known, and your own times of service and what you think about when you think of service. And ask, if we could do the next slide, ask what is the difference, if any, between service as a spiritual practice, conscious, chosen spiritual practice, and just volunteering? Or, is everything service? You got to fix supper for the family. Is that service? Could you talk among yourselves about what you think we're talking about as what is a spiritual practice of service? What might it look like out of your own community or experience? Can you talk about that for a few minutes? So any, as you push towards, what is a spiritual practice of service? What did you talk about? Any particular insights or thoughts worth sharing?
We talked about spiritual practice as being an extension of worship, and that Father David shared with us that the admonition to go and serve at the end of worship, and that spiritual practice is really putting into action the story and the lessons in worship in our lives, and that we had a great example of a family who gave up their Christmas to help others. That they made a family decision to do that. A wonderful story. And how fulfilling that was for the family. So again, it's putting the lessons into action.
Yep, putting the lessons into action. Where I'm pushing for, at least where I go for myself with this, is that, and I want to reflect on it for us individually, but also for our communities. And where I'm going is that there is something different about a conscious, chosen practice or act of service that doesn't have to be meaningful particularly, or moving, or whatever. And I try and do one thing each day that is I'm consciously choosing to do, that I don't need to talk about, and I mean, it's many days it's making the tea. I don't need to do that. I remember my father always got up and made the tea in the morning. And many days I do that for Sage and now for the girls. And I'm doing it as a sort of conscious thing. I say a prayer, which is different.
We do that too.
You do that? But it's not something I'm expecting. There's a level on which it's sort of become my job now. But that's all right. That's all right, because I'm still. And maybe I can get at this a little bit with a little bit more clarity by sharing a conversation that I had each year with these same, not the same students each year, but the same class each year at Candler over the years, where I asked them to say why if they would lead their church into some kind of Christian social ministry, a feeding program or a soup kitchen or a clothes closet or whatever it is. If they were thinking that was a good thing to do, why is that a good thing to do? Why would you have a Christian social ministry as part of your Christian community? Because there are lots of examples of mega churches who say, we don't do that. We partner. We have a day of service where we'll build a Habitat house. We'll partner with them. We don't do that. We just worship and take in money. Lots of money. But so the question would be, and I could have asked you this and decided not to, but the question would be, why do you do it? And sometimes you do it because it's a response to need, and we as a community are, as an extension of the liturgy, responding to need. But maybe what we're doing is giving people an opportunity to practice developing the heart of a servant. Maybe it can be all of the above, and we just have to name it as such. Maybe what we're doing is trying to be a sign of something in the world. Maybe we think we're fixing a social problem. That's unlikely to lead us to be very happy, by the way. My first boss used to like to say, when Jesus said, "The poor will be with you always," it was an observation, not a commandment. What I'm getting at is that the conscious chosen practice here affects, and we look for the effect of it in our lives here. It's the same thing I'm saying about worship in a sense, that it's the practicing our scales is what allows us to make music without having to be terribly agonized or anxious or worked up about it. And similarly, worship and service, whether it's as a whole community or whether it's just an individual matter, is something we can practice here so that we develop the heart of a servant, which makes it easy to give up Christmas or whatever it is that we decide to do. There are many stories from the camps, of course, and many of you will be familiar with Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, and how he saw some people going to their deaths fully alive and others going to their deaths already dead. And I think that our spiritual practice is about claiming life. A few years ago, I visited a couple who had come to the church specifically because she had been diagnosed with a cancer that was going to get her. And they started engaging the life of the church. And I don't judge that at all. They needed and wanted community and some kind of sense of larger picture and a larger story to make sense out of this illness. And I visited them on what turned out to be the day before she died. And the room was very white and there's sunlight coming in, and they were on their bed. And she'd lost her hair and was very thin, and I said the sort of banal thing that I find myself saying. I said, "I don't suppose there's much fun for you at the moment, is there?" And they said, and they'd really obviously thought about it, said, "No, Jeffrey, this is not fun, but we both have deep joy." And I thought, that's it. That's the fruit of the practice at the end of life. And she died the next day, as it turns out. I was going to... I think that whether we have ministries, and I love the call everyone a minister, but whether we have ministries through our congregations or whether we partner with others in the community, whatever, I think it's worth naming why we're doing it, other than it's just a good thing to do, or we ought to do it, or the need was there and we responded, or in other words, we can include in that, you might want to make this a conscious practice of yours because it will help you develop the heart of a servant, and when we serve, we are freed. Right? In a way, I think this is the hardest one of the three, and we'll get at it a lot more easily if we think about the practice of generosity. If I could have the next. Oh, and I was talking to Julie here, and there's another book you might be interested in. This is coming out of the conversation about different kinds of worshiping communities. And there's a guy, he's somewhat evangelical. It's it might be Wycliffe, he's the principal of Wycliffe, or one of the Oxford ministry training theological colleges. His name is Michael Moynagh, Moynagh. Let me write it up here. And the book is called Being Church, Doing Life. And I don't want to, it's a fairly, Deborah, can I write in tongues, so I'm going to ask Deborah to write out. I applied for medical school, they told me I already knew how to write. But this book is, it's not going to be everyone's flavor theologically, but in it are about 150 or so examples, just like you can find them because they're in different kind of print, of new forms of Christian community. Everything from people who are doing laundry for the poor and worshiping together, or people who are working in parks. So some of them are more like church startups, but if you can get past, not caught up in whether or not you like the theology and just read it for the fact there are tons of examples, it might stimulate the imagination as to how we think about developing Christian communities. Can you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? I'm going to suggest that the practice of generosity, which we often call Christian stewardship, is in many respects an antidote to anxiety. And if you would go to the next slide, the question I'd like you to spend some time with each other, this is the last one of these, can I go to the next one? Yes. What is your experience of giving money away? And how do you decide when and what to give? Very similar question to the other ones. I'm driving toward what is the practice? How do you think about that with one another? Are you comfortable enough with one another to talk about money? If you're not, just talk about sex. Okay. Money's easier. Let's do money. And the politics or religion. There you go. That was a lot of energy around money. What did you talk about?
Everybody's trying to get some.
Everybody's trying to get some. I'm with you, brother. I said to the vestry of Epiphany the other day, I said, I love your rich diversity. I just wish there was a bit more rich. Anyone? Yes, ma'am.
We decide we don't like to talk about money. the Christians especially, they don't want to talk about how much they give. You know, it's one of those private discussions. But when your electric bill at your church has to be paid, somebody's got to talk about it. You know, when stewardship comes up, it's like, oh no, it can't be time for that again. Because we don't like to talk about or think about money.
It's a challenge, and it can be very anxiety provoking. Certainly, back to the seminarians, it's amazing how much they hadn't thought about it. Like, why should you give? And the answers were almost always, well, you ought to, or the Bible says tithing, or the Episcopal Church says the tithe is the minimum standard of giving, and suddenly it goes to shoulds and oughts and feeling guilty and I'm not doing enough. And I said, well, wait a minute. Could you maybe talk to yourself and each other about what's going on in the giving that is in fact something that actually could be attractive rather than just a burden and an ought and if you're part of this community, you must give your, how do we get around and away from that? Yes, ma'am. It's hard to be anxious when you're being generous. And obviously we most of us have two, this is oversimplified, two kinds of giving. There's the sustaining giving that we ask of one another, often at this time of the year in the Christian community, to make commitments, and so that our giving is not going to be dependent on how we feel on any given day. Whether I feel like giving, it's more of a sustained and sustaining practice. But the other kind is the kind that is more spontaneous, and maybe it is giving something to a panhandler. And I find that when I get anxious, it will often sooner or later devolve to money. This may not be true. You may find your own ways of dealing with that. But I have developed a practice, a conscious, chosen spiritual practice. When I find myself getting anxious, I make a gift. And I may not feel like it, but I do it. And it may be $1. I walk home up Connecticut Avenue in D.C. and there are 40 people with cups out, and I make a gift, or a memorial fund, or it almost doesn't matter. It's not really about the giving or the recipient as much as it is about what happens when we just change our perspective a little bit. It's not magic, but it just sort of frees me up in some way. I will say that leaving a parish I love after 18 years and moving to DC unemployed, anxiety has been prevalent and it's been really expensive. not just because of the cost of living, but there's a lot of very happy homeless people out there who see me coming, I've made all kinds of friends. I think stewardship may be a word that's lost its power. I one time preached we had a companion relationship with the Diocese of Rio, and I was asked by the bishop to preach about stewardship, which I did, and someone was translating, and it was only afterwards they pointed out there is no word for stewardship in Portuguese, and so I have no idea what they said or what they heard. I don't believe that was maybe the most profound sermon experience they'd ever had, but it was. But anyway, this business. So there's sustained and sustaining giving, and there's the more spontaneous kind of giving, spirit-moved in a moment giving that we might do for any number of reasons. Sometimes I get so good at saying no, I say yes occasionally just so I can. It's it's one of those places. The conversation about panhandling and begging is really important because it reminds us, or it reminds me at any rate, that we're never going to have a system that's going to make us self-justified. We're never going to be able to justify ourselves around this. You get to 10%, you probably need to get to 11. People say, well, is the tithe before or after taxes? I always say, which are you doing now? Come on. Oh, come on, man. I had a member of St. Paul's Alexandria who moved somewhere in Pennsylvania, and a couple of years later, and he was a runner, jogger, and he knew about the jogger's high, anaerobic breathing and all that. And he wrote to me, I can't remember his name, but you'd know who it is, Richard something. And he wrote to me some years later and said, "Dear Jeffrey, when am I going to experience the tither's high?" And again, he was looking for some kind of experience in the giving. And I wonder if the joy is in the giving, and I think it can get there, and it can be there sometimes, but he was looking for it and he wasn't finding it. And I said, well, Richard, I don't know that you're ever going to have a tither's high in that sense, but And I'm not really recommending this as an experiment, but I promise you, if you stop tithing, look at what happens to your life, and look at how you feel, and look at how you respond to people, and you'll find very quickly how important that practice is in terms of its having an effect in life, in your life itself. It's important stuff. Sometimes people talk about sacrificial giving. And I think it is possible to think about giving sacrificially without it being a terrible another ought, or, what do we say, give until it hurts, all that sort of thing. I think if we can help one another understand the power of generosity to free us, to help us claim the promises of the gospel, where we start living more courageously and more hopefully and more generously and more compassionately than we ever thought was possible. All of these spiritual practices point to that, both for us individually in the community, but also for the communities themselves. And so the question comes up for stewardship, budget committees, finance committees, vestries, how do we allocate these resources to be true to who we are, to practice generosity ourselves? So in 2008, some of you will recall that was a trying time for many of us and many of our churches as the recession hit. And what we chose to do out of this kind of thinking at All Saints Atlanta, I'm not trying to brag here, I'm trying to give an example of how it starts shaping how a community thinks. We had to cut some, we said we're not going to do this on the backs of staff. And we had to cut some very beloved, important programs. And we said we're going to increase our giving. And that helped people both deal with the loss and the anxiety, and incredible generosity started coming, even while people were unemployed and couldn't make pledges and so on. We said we're going to be more the church in the face of this crisis, not less the church. And it wasn't just something we could do overnight. It was because we'd been talking not about stewardship so much as about the practice of generosity and the liberating power of spiritual practice for us individually and us as a community. Many of our brothers and sisters think of sacrifice as a mechanical matter of propitiating God. You make a sacrifice to deal with the miasma of sin, or whatever it is. And those of you who've studied it know about the different kinds of offerings and what was going on at the temple in Jesus' day and so on and so forth. But I got a different perspective on this when about 20 years ago I went to the Sudan. The man who is now the presiding bishop of the Sudan, Daniel Dengbul, had been my seminarian, and he was Bishop of Rang. And he invited us to come and see, and a group of people from different churches in Northern Virginia went to visit him. And when we arrived, we went through Khartoum. Many people go through Kenya, but we went through Khartoum. So we were in the northern part. And we arrived, and we were staying the first couple of nights in Khartoum at the diocesan house. And as we walked into the compound, there was no grass, it was just dirt and mud. There was a sheep grazing, or trying to. And when we came out to make our first tour and visit, the sheep wasn't there. Well, we ate that sheep. 7 of us for 10 days. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. For people, many of whom never saw meat, ever. When we drove to Rang, we got permission to travel, which was both prayer and graft. And we went to, and the carcass came with us in the back of the van. And by day 10, I have no idea what body parts we were eating, but it wasn't terribly appetizing. But I thought about what that sheep did, and they saved the skin and all of that. And that fed at least 7 people, 3 meals a day, 10 days, in a place where a great many people never saw meat. And that started me thinking about what a sacrifice is. and how a sacrifice at its best is extraordinarily generous, but is also necessarily kind of placing trust in God for life. It's a reminder, sacrificial living is a reminder that life itself is a gift. Another story from that trip, and then I'll wrap it up. The endless internal civil war that was going on in the Sudan caused there to be many internal refugee camps. And these refugee camps were just ghastly. And the people were basically in a desert without any resources, were expected to somehow make bricks and build houses, and they needed water, and there wasn't water. And then the diocese would put a clinic in or try and start a school, and the government would come and knock it down and destroy it. If you converted from Christianity to Islam in that time, you disappeared from the camp and suddenly found yourself with a good job in the city. It was really intense stuff. And we were visiting a camp, and we were taken to one hut. It was probably about as big as this room, maybe half this room. And it was basically mud walls with a tin roof, and there were about 30 women in this hut with infants. And what they did was they pooled their meager food that they could get, so that on any given day, some of them were going hungry, and they gave all their food so that some of the women could nurse the children, could feed the children. I mean, it was, in a sense, it was lovely. In another sense, it was just unbelievably dreadful. And as we came up, they started singing. And a translator said, what are they singing? The translator said, God does not want us to be here, but we are glad to be alive. And I said, Lord, how can they sing that? She said, oh, it's simple, you're visitors. I said, yeah, what's that? They said, well, this song is the gift for the visitors, because we know we're rich when we can make a gift. I mean, this business of practicing generosity is no more or less liberating, I think, than practicing worship or practicing developing the heart of a servant. But there are all ways in which, if we can get clear that what we're doing doesn't have to necessarily make us feel anything, but instead shape us so that we live more fully and more abundantly the rest of the time, it's lovely if we feel something. It's lovely if we get to a place of joy. The Eucharist is the heart of my own spirituality at this point in many respects. But it's the practice that allows us to live. The practice is not the point. And our people are saying the practice is not the point if we're selling experience, and they're staying away in droves because they get more out of being together for supper around the choir than they do with all that stuff that's going on that doesn't make a whole lot of intuitive sense on Sundays. Now, we can teach it, and we can invite it, whether it's generosity or whether it's service or whether it's worship. And we must do those things. We can also be creative about it. We can also allow ourselves to get less anxious about whether they're getting it or not, and instead find ourselves serving our own people in our own congregations as we try and figure out how to help them enter into the fullness of the promise of the gospel as well. And these practices are a way, a window, a pattern, a start. And as we practice over a lifetime, I mean, our prayer book is designed for a lifetime. Do you think worship should be immediately accessible when someone walks into the church? We do all the stuff with bulletins, talk about trying to make sure the music is of a vernacular for the people coming in. We do all of that stuff if we want to. But should it be? I mean, there's a lot of words. Our worship is designed for a lifetime. Through the life cycle, through the day. And I think by definition is not going to be accessible immediately to anyone walking off the streets. But that doesn't mean we can't find ways in which we can help people worship at other times in their lives as well. And as we tell and enact the story, service and generosity and probably a lot of other practices are part and parcel of the same thing. So as we think about this Nehemiah process and congregational development, I commend to you paying attention to the practices of the community and inviting one another into them. Let us bless the Lord. Thanks be to God.